Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode it's time to pick a side in the Marvel Universe as Captain America and Iron Man go up against each other in Civil War. After a disastrous mission in Lagos becomes the latest in a string of very public and destructive events, the world wants to hold the Avengers to account, introducing the Sokovia Accords, putting them under global oversight. Iron Man, aka Tony Stark, played by Robert Downey Jr., is in favour of oversight, but Steve Rogers, aka Captain America, played by Chris Evans, thinks the Avengers is best left free of their own accord. The tensions between them escalate when Bucky, aka the Winter Soldier, played by Sebastian Stan, is wanted for an act of terrorism, and Steve protects his old friend, believing he didn't do it, making them and their accomplices enemies of Stark. The Captain America movies are some of the best films that Marvel has made, or at the very least the most interesting, because they're the most explicitly political. If you remember the first film, the first Avenger, it was very much a pulpy throwback to the 40s that celebrated wartime spirit of courageousness and patriotism. And of course the character had to be brought into the modern day, which is where the Russo brothers took over the reins. And they have made this character explicitly political because, like the country that he's named after but doesn't entirely represent, Captain America in the modern day is really trying to find his place in the world and whether it's right for him to take action in some senses, especially because our society is a lot more grey and morally ambiguous than it was in World War II, for example. The Captain America movies are very much about facing enemies that are hidden inside ourselves and hidden within our own infrastructures, and that idea continues in Civil War, and it's unavoidable to talk about this film without comparing it to Batman v Superman, considering the two films both share the same premise of superheroes fighting against each other and were released only a few weeks apart, but by extraordinary coincidence, they actually do have several plot points in common, which further reiterates the comparison between them. And where Batman v Superman got things wrong, Civil War gets those things very right by comparison. And the biggest difference between them is that you can understand in Civil War why the characters differ in opinion the way that they do. Why do their values lead them to conflict? One of the things that struck me about the film was not the action sequences necessarily. There's an early scene in the film where all the Avengers, bar Hulk and Thor, are all speaking together, and they're talking about the ethics of whether they should sign the Accords, and Stark says that they should do because they are a global task force. This is what they do, and their powers are incredibly destructive. That they could cause harm to people. They have done harm to people. They need to be held in check. They need to have some responsibility for their actions, and that is a fair point. But when Steve argues against it and says that if they are being ruled by someone, those people in charge have an agenda of some kind, which may not necessarily line up with their own. Another fair point. Civil War gets it right by having a complicated moral quandary at its centre and not giving us an answer because there is none. This is where Marvel's continuity pays off, in that we understand, because we know the histories of these characters, we understand where they're all coming from, and it says something that Marvel is so confident in its filmmaking, its continuity, and its characters that it will allow them to just talk. And I found that remarkably refreshing for a big blockbuster. It's a surprisingly thoughtful moment. Chris Evans is reliably fantastic in the title role, and he sums up the virtues of the character without appearing to be a Boy Scout. But that's helped in part because Captain America is such a complicated figure in these movies, having to navigate these moral quandaries. And that is especially the case in his relationship with his old friend Bucky, because on the one hand, his commitment to his friend shows up the strength of his character, that he is so willing to protect him in the face of all possible evidence, he is fighting the fight that no one else will. But at the same time, there's also the sense that Bucky is his weakness that will allow him to do things that might compromise his ideals and his values. The one disappointment that I had with this movie is because there are so many characters, and it's much more of an Avengers-led feature this time. It's basically an Avengers movie in all but name. There is less of Captain America here as a character. He does at some points drift more into the background because he's not the central focus of this particular movie, which is a little bit of a shame, but greatly making up for that fact is Robert Downey Jr.'s performance as Tony Stark. And this version of Tony is probably the darkest version of the character that we've seen so far. His conscience and his ego is damaged. He is aware of the fact that his actions have consequences, and he is dealing with the fallout of many decisions on both a superhero level and a personal level, and that is eating away at him inside. And he thinks he is doing these things for what he feels are the right reasons. But even though he is justified in that, that can lead him into avenues that may harm his friends, that may compromise his relationships to his fellow Avengers. And that's not to say that Robert Downey Jr.'s performance isn't entertaining. It is, but he's not doing the motor-mouth thing anymore. This is a very different side to that character, and it really brings an element of nuance to an established player in this universe. This idea that he is almost the antagonist here is an interesting one, considering that this whole universe started with him. One of the great things about this movie is, despite this huge cast, this movie seems to have everyone in the world in it, and with all these subplots going on, it never feels cluttered or crowded, so you always feel like they have a reason to be there, and it never feels like anyone is particularly underutilised in the main cast. It always feels like they have a little thing to do, and it makes you glad that they were there. It's clear that the Russos have really paid time to try and understand the logic and flow of what's happening. And this is a vast improvement over Age of Ultron, which really buckled under the strain to some extent of having to do this event film, but also set up all these other strands that later films in the Marvel Universe will have to pick up. And the Russos managed to do that here almost effortlessly. There are things that are obviously being set up for later movies here, but they don't detract from the main plotline of the movie. And before I talk about all the other Avengers-related items, I should mention Daniel Bruhl as the manipulator Zemo, who is very much on the sidelines of the movie, and I was quietly impressed by his performance. What he very smartly does is that he underplays this character, because he is this shadowy manipulator, and that is a vast relief to Jesse Eisenberg's Lex Luthor, who was very over the top, and it didn't make much sense. Here, because Zemo's motives and his ambitions are so shrouded in mystery for the rest of the movie, that very quiet performance, in comparison to everything else, builds up the mystery surrounding this character and what he's trying to do, and it really powers the narrative. Now, what I'm obviously going to have to talk about is the new members introduced in this movie: Chadwick Boseman's Black Panther and Tom Holland's Spider-Man. And Black Panther, I liked Black Panther in this movie. I thought they did a good job of introducing this character. There is this idea in the movie of accountability that moves into vengeance, and this is one of the earliest representations of that theme, in that Black Panther has a very personal engagement in trying to track down the Winter Soldier. He becomes this third party that is a legitimate threat to all the other characters around him, because he very much embodies vengeance. Again, he doesn't have a huge part here. It's clear that they are building him towards his own movie, rightfully so. In my opinion, Spider-Man felt like the most sort of crowbarred in element, because he doesn't appear in the movie until at least the halfway point, and there is this very lengthy introductory scene that has to set up this new version of Spider-Man. Marisa Tomei's Aunt May also appears as well. I liked Holland as Spider-Man. He gets the perfect sense of this character in that he's wisecracking and he's funny and he's a little bit cocky, but he's also a little bit out of his depth here. This is a very early Spider-Man who's still finding his feet, so to speak, and he's almost awed at what he finds himself into, because he's basically surrounded by the Avengers, and that's what's really crucial to the big face-off between Team Cap and Team Iron Man. They really have fun. You get a sense in that sequence that the Russos have got all these characters together and they've got all these cool powers. Now let's see what they can do and let's see how they interact with each other. It's like kids playing with toys in a sandbox. And I think that's one of the great things about the Marvel continuity, is that you have all these characters built up in one place. And having this big battle really strengthens their relationships and dynamics. There is a lot of banter and a lot of humour in this particular sequence. And a lot of that is because the two sides, although it's a personal struggle between Iron Man and Captain America, a lot of the people they've drafted in, it's not really their fight. So to some extent, they're just simply playing with kid gloves, and that really builds up the sense of fun and lightheartedness in a movie that has been fairly dark to that point. That the sequence is a welcome relief. One who almost steals the movie with a minimum of screen time is Paul Rudd's Ant-Man. He may not be in the movie for very long, but he gets several major moments in this sequence, and it feels especially like they're really enjoying playing with his character's powers and abilities and what he can do. And I think the Russos are very, very smart, because the movie essentially climaxes twice. The blowout on the airfield is very much the first climax that gives you the spectacle and blockbuster action that you would expect from a film like this, which allows them to build towards the second climax, which is somewhat unconventional for a film of this size. That makes sense because there is no point trying to top that earlier sequence. It would always feel like an anticlimax to have another big action sequence, whereas having this very personal conflict at the end of the movie feels a lot more emotionally satisfying with everything that we've been playing with up until this point. Is this the best Captain America movie? Not quite. I think The Winter Soldier is still the strongest of the three movies, simply because it has the most focus on Captain America as a character. I think that draws this third entry back, but at the same time, this has a much stronger ending than The Winter Soldier. The Winter Soldier had a big destructive climax that felt sort of obligated at the end of that movie. Civil War spends a lot of time earning the big payoffs in the later reels of the film. It's a film that does take a little while to get going, but I think most people will be very satisfied by its conclusion and the way the characters interact with each other. It would be very interesting to see where the Marvel Universe goes from this point onward. And I have to say that the confidence that the Russos have with juggling this many balls does give me some renewed confidence in the Marvel Universe after Age of Ultron. On one last point, I saw this movie in its regular 3D presentation, not its IMAX 3D presentation. The film has been shot in selected sequences with IMAX cameras, so it does open up in the IMAX presentation, but not in the regular 3D or 2D presentations. In the big action sequences, especially with Iron Man flying around and Spidey jumping around, I think there are moments here that really pull towards the 3D format if you like that sort of thing. My personal recommendation, however, is to see it flat, because there are a lot of scenes in this movie that are simply characters talking that don't really have any benefit being in 3D, and some of the action sequences here, especially the first one in Lagos, doesn't really work well in 3D because there's far too many quick cuts and green grass shaky cam. Again, that doesn't really work well in that particular format. So if I had to make a recommendation, I would say see it in 2D, but if you do see it in 3D, I don't think it will detract from your enjoyment. I think there are a couple of moments that work well, but generally I think you should go and see this movie. It's very good. Captain America Civil War may not be the character's best film, but it's another highly enjoyable addition to the Marvel canon. In relation to its own Civil War with Batman v Superman, this movie does everything right by comparison, including two lead characters whose conflict is understandable and logical, playing upon the audience's own history with the characters, and managing its darker tone with some good humour as well. The additions of Black Panther and Spider-Man are welcome and well utilised, and despite the huge cast, it never feels messy in the same way Age of Ultron was. While Evans remains strong as the title character, it's Downey Jr.'s more melancholic take on Tony Stark that's the film's most effective element. Satisfying both on spectacle and emotionally, this is intelligent popcorn entertainment that bodes well for the Russo brothers taking on the Avengers two-parter. Coming up soon, Idris Elba fights terrorists in Paris in Bastille Day, Meryl Streep is the notoriously awful singer Florence Foster Jenkins, and some more bad neighbours move next door to Seth Rogen. But until then, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.